The Widower Who Remarried Too Soon, a Lower Nettlecombe mystery, featuring Miss Hepzibah Quill, Lower Nettlecombe, Suffolk, July 1951. Chapter 1. The Second Mrs. Fenn. The wedding of Aldous Fenn to Miss Rosalind Carew was, by any honest reckoning, an indecently swift affair, and every soul in Lower Nettlecombe had an opinion about it, whether or not one had been requested. Margaret Fenn had been buried in March, beneath the yew at St. Osyth's, with the whole village turned out in dark coats, despite a cold wind that cut through wool as though it were muslin. By the second week of July, a bare 16 weeks later, the same church bell was ringing for Aldous' second marriage, and the same villagers were filing into the same pews, this time in their brightest hats, murmuring behind gloved hands about the indecency of it all. 16 weeks, said Mrs. Ottoline Bream to her neighbour in the third pew, not troubling to lower her voice much. I buried my Harold's terrier with more ceremony than that, and I didn't replace the poor creature inside a year. Miss Hepzibah Quill, seated 2 rows behind with her gloved hands folded neatly over a rolled umbrella she had brought against a sky that showed no sign of rain, said nothing at all. She was 74 years old, small and silver-haired, with pale blue eyes that missed remarkably little, and a habit of appearing, to those who did not know her well, to be thinking of nothing more pressing than her dahlias. She had grown 3 prize blooms of a shade nobody else in the county had managed, and she was, by general village consensus, a harmless old thing who liked her garden and her library book, and asked altogether too many questions about people's aunts. She watched Rosalind Carew come up the aisle on the arm of her brother, a tall, sun-browned young man named Victor, who had arrived from Bath only 2 days before, and whom nobody in the village had properly met. The bride was handsome rather than pretty, with a decided chin and a way of holding her shoulders that suggested she was accustomed to being looked at and did not much mind it. She wore ivory silk, not white, a detail several ladies of the parish had already discussed at some length, as though the shade of a frock might itself constitute a confession. Aldous Fenn stood at the altar rail looking, Miss Quill thought, less like a bridegroom than a man enduring a rather trying medical appointment. He was 51, greying at the temples, with the stooped shoulders of a man who had spent 30 years bent over ledgers at the Nettlecombe and District Bank. His first wife, Margaret, had been a quiet, anxious little woman with a weak heart. Everybody said so, had said so for years, ever since a bout of rheumatic fever in her girlhood had left her, as old Dr. Filmer put it, delicate in that department. Her death in March alone in her bed one grey morning while Aldous was at the bank had surprised no one and grieved, so far as the village could tell, chiefly her husband, her son Julian, and her old friend Miss Prudence Aldecott, who had trained as a nurse before the First War, and had looked in on Margaret 2 or 3 times a week for the better part of a decade. It was this same Miss Aldecott whom Hepzibah Quill now observed sitting rigidly upright in the second pew, her narrow face the colour of tallow, her eyes fixed not upon the bride and groom, but upon some point on the flagstones several feet in front of her own shoes. She had not, Miss Quill noted, sung a note of the opening hymn, though her lips had moved through the motions of it. Now that, thought Miss Quill, is interesting. She had known Prudence Aldecott for 11 years, ever since the Aldecotts had taken the cottage next to the Fens, and she had never once seen the woman fail to sing a hymn with the particular fervour of someone who had once trained as a nurse and considered lung capacity a moral virtue. Beside Miss Quill, the Reverend Aubrey Locksley conducted the service with a fixed, professional smile that did not entirely reach his eyes, and stumbled, very slightly, over the word cherish. Julian Fenn, Aldous' son from his first marriage, a serious young man of 26 who worked as a clerk in his father's own bank, stood as best man, with his jaw set in a manner that suggested he had rehearsed his expression of goodwill rather more carefully than his father had rehearsed his vows. When the ring was placed, Julian's eyes flicked, just once, toward Miss Aldcott in the second pew, and something passed between them that Miss Quill, watching with the mild, unfocused gaze she had perfected over 7 decades of being underestimated, filed carefully away. The wedding breakfast was held in the garden of Fen House, a handsome red-brick property at the edge of the village, with a lawn that ran down to the river, and a summer house where, Miss Quill recalled, Margaret Fenn had liked to sit on fine afternoons with her needlework and her weak heart, watching the water go by. Trestle tables had been set beneath the old cedar, laid with cold ham, a magnificent iced cake the colour of clotted cream, and a great crystal punch bowl of Mrs. Pettigrew's celebrated cordial, a family recipe of elderflower and lemon that the housekeeper had been making for the Fenns for as long as anyone could remember, always served in a silver ladle that had belonged, originally, to Aldous' own mother. 16 weeks, Mrs. Bream said again, accepting a glass of the cordial from a tray, and already a new mistress of the house. I don't say a word against Miss Carew, mind, but I do wonder what poor Margaret would have made of it. Perhaps, said Miss Quill mildly, accepting a glass of her own, we ought to ask Miss Aldcott. She was closer to Margaret than any of us. Mrs. Bream's eyes lit with the particular gleam of a woman who has just been handed a fresh piece of gossip to carry home. Do you know, she said, lowering her voice at last, I heard Miss Aldcott went to see the solicitor, Mr. Sharp, not a fortnight after the funeral. Wanted to know something about Margaret's will, I shouldn't wonder. How very odd, said Miss Quill, and meant it. She looked across the lawn to where Aldous Fenn stood beside his new bride, receiving congratulations with the strained good humour of a man at his own trial, and beyond them, to where Miss Prudence Aldcott stood entirely alone at the edge of the cedar's shade, a glass of the cordial untouched in her hand, watching the happy couple with an expression that was not envy and was not grief, but was, Miss Quill decided, turning the thought over with the same careful attention she gave to a new cultivar, something closer to dread. It was, all things considered, a very great pity that within the hour. Before we continue, a quick message for every mystery lover. If you're enjoying this story, you'll love the Baker Street Library, my collection of exclusive detective mystery ebooks available only in ebook format. Download instantly and enjoy your next investigation anytime. You'll find the link in the description, the pinned comment, and the channel description. Now, let's get back to the mystery. Miss Prudence Aldcott would be dead upon the lawn, and that nobody, not the bride, not the groom, not the vicar, not even Miss Hepzibah Quill herself, though she came nearer than most, would understand the true shape of what had happened until a good deal more had been lost. Chapter 2. A Toast Too Soon. The toasts began at 3:30, when the sun had softened from its noon brightness into the long gold slant of a Suffolk afternoon, and the guests had settled onto folding chairs arranged in loose rows facing the cedar tree, glasses of Mrs. Pettigrew's cordial in hand for those who did not care for champagne, which Aldous Fenn, in a fit of old-fashioned economy that several guests found rather touching, had provided only for the immediate family. Mr. Nathaniel Sharp, the family solicitor, rose first, a stout, red-faced man of 60, with a fondness for his own voice that had made him, over 4 decades of practice, both an excellent public speaker and a rather tiresome dinner guest. He spoke for perhaps 6 minutes on the subject of Aldous Fenn's steadiness of character, the Fenn family's long association with the parish, and the particular good fortune that had brought Miss Carew, a young woman of spirit, if I may say so, and not without her own resources, into their midst. Miss Quill noted the phrase, "not without her own resources," and wondered, not for the first time that day, precisely what resources Rosalind Carew was understood to possess, and whether the village's assumption that she had married for money was as settled a fact as everyone seemed to believe. Julian Fenn spoke next. briefly and with visible effort, wishing his father happiness, in a voice that cracked once, almost imperceptibly, on the word happiness itself. He did not look at his father as he spoke. He looked, throughout the whole of his short speech, at a point somewhere above and beyond the assembled guests, as a man might look who was determined not to catch anyone's eye. Then Aldous Fenn rose to reply, and it was here that the incident occurred which the village would discuss, in one form or another, for a very long time afterward. "I am not a man given to speeches," Aldous began, in the flat, careful tone of a bank manager reading a balance sheet, "and I shan't detain you long. I will only say that a man does not expect, at 51, to find happiness twice in a lifetime, and that I am grateful, profoundly grateful, for the chance to do so." He paused, and here Miss Quill, watching closely, observed something curious. His eyes travelled, for the briefest of instants, to Miss Prudence Aldcott, standing still at the edge of the cedar's shade, and something in his expression tightened, not with tenderness, nor with grief, but with what looked, to Miss Quill's experienced eye, remarkably like fear. "To my dear wife," Aldous continued, raising his glass, "and to the memory of those we have loved and lost, whose place in our hearts no new happiness can ever truly fill." It was, Miss Quill thought, a rather strange thing to say at one's own wedding breakfast, and she was not alone in the observation. She saw Mrs. Bream exchange a glance with her neighbour, and heard, from somewhere behind her, a soft, disapproving murmur. Mrs. Pettigrew moved among the guests with her silver ladle, refilling glasses of cordial, and it was as this second round was being poured that Miss Aldcott, still standing apart from the others, set down her own glass, the first, untouched, upon the low stone wall beside her, and walked forward, with the deliberate, unhurried step of a woman who has made up her mind about something and does not intend to be talked out of it, toward the place where Aldous Fenn stood with his new bride. "Aldous," she said, and her voice, though not raised, carried with the particular clarity of a trained speaker across the sudden hush of the lawn. "I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private. Prudence, this is hardly—" "It won't wait," she said. "It has waited quite long enough already." There was a silence of the kind that falls over a garden party when 40 people simultaneously decide to pretend they are not listening to a conversation 6 feet away. Rosalind Fenn's hand tightened, very slightly, on her new husband's arm. Julian Fenn, standing near the cake table, went entirely still. "Very well," Aldous said at last, his voice tight. "After the cutting of the cake, I promise you, Prudence, we shall speak." Miss Aldcott looked at him for a long moment. A look, Miss Quill thought later, of measuring, of weighing something in the balance, and finding it, perhaps, not quite enough. And then she nodded, once, and turned away, accepting a fresh glass of cordial from Mrs. Pettigrew's tray as she passed, the very picture, to any casual observer, of a guest returning to the ordinary business of a wedding afternoon. She drank from it as she walked back toward the shade of the cedar. She did not reach it. 12 steps from the tray, Prudence Aldcott stopped, quite suddenly, as though she had walked into an invisible wall. The glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the flagstones bordering the lawn. She put one hand to her throat, and the other, gropingly, toward the back of a nearby chair, and her face, which had been the colour of tallow all afternoon, went the colour of old paper. "Prudence!" It was Julian Fenn who reached her first, catching her by the shoulders as her knees gave way beneath her, lowering her, with the careful, practised motion of a man who had watched his own mother collapse in much the same fashion not 4 months before, onto the grass. "Fetch Dr. Filmer," someone was shouting. "Fetch him at once, he's not 5 minutes away." But Miss Hepzibah Quill, who had risen from her folding chair with rather more speed than her 74 years generally allowed, and who now knelt beside Julian Fenn on the lawn, looking down into the grey, twisted face of Prudence Aldecott, understood, with the calm, terrible clarity of a woman who had seen death before and knew its shape when it arrived, that Dr. Filmer, however quickly he came, would arrive a good deal too late. Chapter 3. The Cordial and the Collapse. Dr. Filmer arrived within the promised 5 minutes, his black bag swinging from one hand, and his hat, in his haste, left behind altogether on the seat of his motor car, and it took him rather less than 2 minutes more to confirm what Miss Quill had already understood to be true. "She's gone," he said quietly, sitting back on his heels on the grass, his fingers still resting at the pulse point of Prudence Aldecott's wrist, as though reluctant to accept the evidence of his own training. "I'm sorry. There was nothing to be done. Nothing anyone could have done, I think, once it began." The garden, which not 10 minutes before had rung with the ordinary cheerful noise of a wedding breakfast, the clink of glasses, the murmur of conversation, a child's laughter somewhere near the river, had fallen into a silence so complete that Miss Quill could hear the small sounds of the water moving over stones at the foot of the lawn, and, further off, a wood pigeon calling from the elms beyond the churchyard wall. Rosalind Fenn stood very still beside her new husband, her ivory silk catching the last of the afternoon sun, her face drained of every trace of colour. Aldous Fenn himself had not moved from the spot where he had stood to make his toast. He stared down at the small, crumpled figure on the grass, with an expression Miss Quill found impossible to read. Not quite grief, not quite shock, but something that might, in a less controlled man, have been the beginning of panic. Julian Fenn knelt still beside the body, one hand resting, quite unconsciously, on Miss Aldecott's shoulder, as though he could not bring himself to withdraw it. What was it? The question came from Nathaniel Sharp, who had pushed his way through the small crowd of guests now gathering at a respectful distance, his red face gone rather grey itself. A seizure of some kind? Her heart? "I shan't say until I've had a proper look," Dr. Filmer said, but there was something careful in the way he said it, something that made Miss Quill's pale blue eyes narrow very slightly. He had been the family physician in Lower Nettlecombe for the better part of 30 years. He had attended Margaret Fenn in her final illness not 4 months before, and Miss Quill did not think it escaped his notice, any more than it escaped her own, that the symptoms he had just observed in Prudence Aldecott's final moments bore a certain unhappy resemblance to those Margaret herself had displayed. "She had a glass of cordial in her hand," said a voice from the small crowd. It was Mrs. Bream again, unable, even now, to resist the pull of an observation. "I saw her take it from Mrs. Pettigrew's tray not 2 minutes before it happened." There was a small collective movement among the guests, a kind of silent recoiling, as every eye in the garden turned, as one, toward the crystal punch bowl still standing on its trestle table beneath the cedar, the silver ladle resting within it, catching the light. "That's absurd," said Aldous Fenn sharply, finding his voice at last. "That cordial has been served at every gathering in this house for 20 years. Half the guests here have had 2 glasses of it already." "All the same," said Dr. Filmer slowly, "I think, Aldous, that until I know a good deal more, nobody had better drink any more of it." It was Miss Hepzibah Quill who moved, then with the quiet, unremarkable efficiency of a woman accustomed to tidying up after garden parties, and lifted the punch bowl herself from the trestle table, carrying it, silver ladle and all, into the cool of the scullery, where she set it upon the stone floor and covered it with a clean tea-towel, exactly as though she were merely putting away the leftovers of an ordinary afternoon. Nobody thought to question why a guest, and not the housekeeper, had performed this small service. Nobody, in the confusion of the moment, thought to question Miss Quill at all, which suited her very well, for it gave her the opportunity, in the 3 minutes she spent alone in the scullery, to lift the ladle to her nose and inhale, very carefully, the sweet, faintly bitter scent that lingered beneath the elderflower and lemon, a scent she recognized, though she said nothing of it then to anyone, from her own garden, where a bed of tall, speckled foxglove grew against the north wall of her cottage, and had grown there, tended and admired, for as long as she had lived in Lower Nettlecombe. She returned to the garden in time to hear Inspector Colborne's motor car pull up at the gate, summoned, she gathered, by young Julian Fenn himself, who had run to the telephone in the hall the moment Dr. Filmer's face had told him what words had not yet confirmed, and to observe, with the particular attentiveness she brought to matters of this kind, that Rosalind Fenn, in the 20 minutes since her wedding breakfast had become the scene of a sudden and violent death, had not once wept, had not once reached for her husband's hand, and had not once looked away from the small, still figure on the lawn, but had watched it, throughout, with an expression of concentration so intense that it might almost, in a woman less newly married, have been mistaken for calculation. Chapter 4. Whispers over the Hedge. By the following morning, there was not a household in Lower Nettlecombe that had not heard some version of the story, and there was not a version that agreed entirely with any other. Miss Quill learned this for herself while cutting sweet peas in her own front garden, a task that placed her, by fortunate accident of geography, within easy earshot of the lane along which the greater part of the village's foot traffic passed on its way to the shop and back, and within easier earshot still of her own garden hedge, on the far side of which Mrs. Bream had paused, ostensibly to admire the sweet peas, but in fact, as both women perfectly understood, to exchange the morning's intelligence. They say it was her heart, Mrs. Bream reported, with the faint disappointment of a woman who had hoped for something more sensational. Dr. Filmer's given a certificate, or so I hear, and there's to be no inquest at all, only a formality. Is that so? Said Miss Quill, snipping a sweet pea with rather more force than the stem required. Well, and why shouldn't it be her heart? She was past 60, and she'd nursed poor Margaret Fenn through her own final illness, which can't have done a delicate constitution any good, all those months of worry. And you know how these things run in families sometimes, though of course she wasn't family to the Fenns at all, only a very old friend. Very old friends, said Miss Quill, sometimes know things that families do not. Mrs. Bream's eyes brightened with interest. Now what do you mean by that, Hepzibah? But Miss Quill, who had learned long ago that the surest way to draw information out of Lower Nettlecombe was to appear entirely uninterested in receiving it, only smiled her mild, vague smile, and said she meant nothing at all by it, only that old friends were sometimes better confidants than sisters, and would Mrs. Bream care for a bunch of sweet peas to take home, as she had rather more than she knew what to do with. Mrs. Bream, mollified by the flowers and thoroughly unsatisfied by the conversation, went on her way, and Miss Quill returned to her cutting, with the particular stillness of a mind working a good deal harder than her hands. She had not slept well. She had spent a portion of the previous evening, after the police had come and gone, after Prudence Aldercott's small body had been carried away in the ambulance from Ipswich, after the wedding guests had dispersed in twos and threes with the hushed, half-guilty excitement of people who have witnessed something they will discuss, in careful whispers, for months to come, sitting at her own kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold before her, turning over in her mind the sequence of events she had observed. There had been Miss Aldercott's odd, dreadful stillness throughout the ceremony, and her refusal to touch her first glass of cordial. There had been the strange exchange at the toast. I wonder if I might have a word with you, in private. It won't wait. It has waited quite long enough already. There had been Aldous Fenn's own toast, with its curious reference to the memory of those we have loved and lost, whose place in our hearts no new happiness can ever truly fill. A toast that had seemed, even at the time, to strike a note of guilt rather than grief. There had been the scent beneath the elderflower and lemon in Mrs. Pettigrew's silver ladle, a scent Miss Quill knew perfectly well from her own garden and did not think she had imagined. And there had been, above all, the coincidence, if coincidence it truly was, that Prudence Aldecott, the one person in Lower Nettlecombe who had nursed Margaret Fenn through the final months of her life, and who might, therefore, know a very great deal about the precise manner and progress of that lady's death, had herself died within the hour of announcing her intention to speak to Aldous Fenn in private, and had died, moreover, displaying symptoms that Dr. Filmer's careful evasions suggested he found disquietingly familiar. Miss Quill did not, as a rule, permit herself to leap to conclusions. It was, she had found over a long lifetime of quiet observation, a habit that led as often to error as to insight, and she preferred, wherever possible, to gather her facts as she gathered her dahlias, patiently, one bloom at a time, with a great deal of unglamorous work in the soil, before anything worth admiring appeared above ground. But she permitted herself, that morning among her sweet peas, one small and private certainty, that Prudence Aldecott had not died of a weak heart, that her death was connected, by some thread not yet visible, to the death of Margaret Fenn 4 months before, and that whatever Miss Aldecott had meant to tell Aldous Fenn in private, she had known it for some time, and had been waiting, for what, Miss Quill could not yet say, to speak it aloud. She set down her scissors, gathered what remained of her sweet peas into a loose bunch, and went indoors to write a short note to Inspector Colborne, whom she had known, in a professional capacity, on 2 previous occasions, and whose good sense she trusted rather more than his imagination. "My dear Inspector," she wrote, "I wonder whether you have yet spoken to Dr. Filmer regarding the precise circumstances of Margaret Fenn's death this past March. I do not say there was anything irregular about it. I say only that it might be worth asking. She did not sign the note with any flourish, only her name, and she posted it herself that same afternoon, on her way to the shop, with the small private satisfaction of a woman who has planted a seed and does not intend to dig it up again to see whether it has taken root, only to wait, with patience, for whatever might grow." Chapter 5. The Vicar's Discomfort. Inspector Colborne was a broad, deliberate man of 45, with a moustache the colour of wet sand, and a manner that had, over 15 years in the county force, hardened into a kind of patient, unhurried scepticism that served him rather better than the flights of theory favoured by younger officers. He had worked with Miss Quill twice before, once over the matter of a disappearing legacy at Nettlecombe Grange, and once, more gravely, over a drowning at the mill pond that had turned out, on close examination, to be nothing of the kind. And he had learned, on both occasions, that her notes, however mildly phrased, were not to be dismissed. He called at her cottage on the Thursday morning, 2 days after the wedding, and accepted a cup of tea with the air of a man settling in for a longer conversation than either of them would openly admit to wanting. "Dr. Filmer's given his certificate for Aldecott," he said, without preamble. "Heart failure. He's not entirely happy about it, mind, but he's not unhappy enough to refuse to sign it either, not without something more to go on than an old woman's odd behaviour at a wedding. And Margaret Fenn's death in March? Same doctor, same certificate, same cause. Filmer attended her himself the morning she died, found her already gone, and signed it off without a second thought. Why would he? She'd had a weak heart for 30 years. Half the village could have told you she'd go that way eventually. Colborne set down his cup. "You'll understand, Miss Quill, that I can hardly go digging up a grave on the strength of a note asking me to." "I should think not," Miss Quill agreed. "But you might perhaps ask Dr. Filmer a rather more particular question than the one he was originally asked. Not was it her heart? Of course it was her heart, in the sense that her heart stopped, as everybody's heart eventually does. But what stopped it?" Colborne regarded her for a long moment over the rim of his cup. "You think there's a connection between the two deaths?" "I think," said Miss Quill carefully, "that Prudence Aldecott nursed Margaret Fenn through the last months of her illness, and knew, therefore, a very great deal about the precise nature of that illness. Knew it, I should imagine, rather better than Dr. Filmer himself, who saw the patient perhaps once a fortnight, while Miss Aldecott sat with her 3 and 4 times a week. I think Miss Aldecott announced, at her friend's own husband's wedding breakfast, that she had something to say to him in private, and that she used the word waited, that it had waited long enough. And I think that within 20 minutes of making that announcement, she was dead, having drunk from a punch bowl that smelled, very faintly, of something a great deal less innocent than elderflower and lemon. You kept the bowl. I put it in the scullery under a tea towel, Inspector, which is not quite the same thing as an official seizure of evidence, but I imagine Mrs. Pettigrew has not yet found occasion to wash it out, if you were to ask her promptly." Colborne's moustache twitched in what might, in a less guarded man, have been the beginning of a smile. "I'll ask," he said, "and I'll have a word with Filmer about a proper post-mortem. That much I can manage without troubling the coroner's patients too far. But I'll tell you plainly, Miss Quill, if there's foxglove in that bowl, as you seem to suspect, half the guests at that wedding drank from it too, and none of them so much as felt queer. Why should it kill one woman and leave 40 others untouched?" "That," said Miss Quill, "is precisely the question I intend to answer, Inspector, though I rather think the answer has nothing to do with the bowl at all, and everything to do with the glass." She did not elaborate further, and Colborne, who had learned not to press her before she was ready, finished his tea and took his leave, promising to send word the moment Dr. Filmer's second, more careful examination was complete. Miss Quill's next call, that same afternoon, was upon the Reverend Aubrey Locksley, whom she found in the vestry of St. Osyth's, sorting through a stack of hymn books with the distracted air of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. "Miss Quill." He looked up, and something in his face, a kind of flinching, quickly suppressed, told her that her visit was not entirely welcome, though he was too well-mannered a man to say so. "A dreadful business on Tuesday. Dreadful. Poor Miss Aldecott. You knew her well, I think, better than most of the parish. She was a regular communicant, a woman of firm faith and firmer opinions." He set down the hymn books and folded his hands, a gesture Miss Quill recognised as the one he adopted for parishioners in need of comfort, and wondered, not for the first time, whether he was about to offer it to her or to himself. "I don't mind telling you, Miss Quill, that she came to me, a fortnight ago perhaps, in some distress. She wished to discuss a matter of conscience." "Did she tell you what the matter was?" "She did not in any detail, only that she believed she had a duty to speak the truth about something, and that she was afraid of the consequences of doing so, not to herself, she was quite clear on that point, but to others, to someone she cared for." He hesitated. "I told her, as I would tell anyone, that the truth withheld out of misplaced kindness has a way of doing more harm in the end than the truth spoken plainly at the start. I wonder now whether that was good advice." "Did she mention any names?" "She did not." The vicar's eyes slid very briefly toward the vestry window, through which the tower of Fen House was just visible above the elms. "But I formed the impression, Miss Quill, and I stress that it was only an impression, that the matter concerned Margaret Fenn's final months. Prudence spoke of her a great deal in those last weeks." Of what a hard death it had been for so quiet and gentle a woman. She used a phrase that has stayed with me rather more than I should like. She said that Margaret had died frightened, and that no one but herself seemed to have noticed it, or to have asked why. Miss Quill sat very still. Frightened of what, did she say? No, said the Reverend Locksley, and there was something in his voice now that suggested the conversation had gone further than he wished it to. She did not say, and I did not ask, Miss Quill, because I did not think it was my place to pry into a dying woman's private fears, and I confess I wish now, very much, that I had asked anyway. Chapter 6. What the Nurse Knew. The post-mortem examination of Prudence Aldecott, conducted with rather more thoroughness than Dr. Filmer's first hurried certificate had reflected, produced its findings on the Saturday, and Inspector Colborne brought them himself to Miss Quill's cottage, arriving so early that she had not yet finished her breakfast and was obliged to receive him at her kitchen table over a plate of toast that grew steadily colder as he spoke. Digitalis poisoning, he said, without preamble, laying a folded paper on the table between them. A substantial quantity, considerably more than a weak heart could account for on its own, whatever her natural constitution. The pathologist's quite certain. It would have acted quickly too, a matter of 20 minutes to half an hour from ingestion to collapse, depending on the dose, which fits the timing well enough. And Margaret Fenn, Colborne's face, above the sand-coloured moustache, was grim. We can't exhume without a great deal more to go on than we currently have, Miss Quill, and I'll tell you frankly the coroner won't thank me for asking, on the strength of a resemblance in symptoms 4 months after burial. But I've had a long talk with Filmer, and he admits, reluctantly mind, the man doesn't like to think he might have signed a false certificate, that Margaret Fenn's final collapse showed features he didn't examine as closely as perhaps he ought. She'd had heart trouble for years, true enough, and digitalis itself is a medicine as much as a poison. Filmer had her on a small prescribed dose for her condition, which makes the whole business a good deal murkier, because a modest overdose might pass entirely unremarked in a patient already taking the drug. Miss Quill set down her toast. So whoever poisoned Prudence Aldecott would have known that digitalis, in the right hands, is a peculiarly forgiving poison to use. Forgiving to the poisoner, I mean, not the victim. Given to a woman with a known heart condition, it need arouse no suspicion at all. Given, 4 months later, to a perfectly healthy woman of 60 who had no heart trouble whatsoever, it becomes rather harder to explain away, unless, of course, the poisoner believed that no one would think to look for it in either case, since both women were of an age and situation where sudden death excites grief but not investigation. Which brings us back, said Colborne, to the punch bowl, foxglove growing wild along the riverbank at the bottom of the fen garden. I had a constable walk the bank yesterday, and he found a fine stand of it not 40 yards from the summer-house, some of it recently cut, or so he believes, though I'll grant a torn stem after a week of weather is no evidence a court would look at twice. And in my own garden, Miss Quill said quietly, against the north wall, where I have grown it for 11 years, admired by every visitor who has ever taken tea with me, including, I do not doubt, a good many of the Fenn household and their friends. You're not a suspect, Miss Quill, if that's what you're driving at. I am merely observing, Inspector, that foxglove is not a rare plant in an English village garden in July, and that half the cottages in Lower Nettlecombe could supply a murderer with all he required, without arousing the least suspicion by the purchase. Whoever did this did not need to go far, or take any risk of being noticed obtaining what they needed, which tells us something, I think, about a person who plans with care. Colborne drank the last of the tea Miss Quill had poured him, and turned the folded paper over in his broad hands. There's one thing more, he said. The pathologist found something else in her stomach contents, alongside the digitalis. Traces of a sedative, chloral, in a small quantity. Nothing that would have harmed her on its own, but enough to explain, perhaps, why she went down so fast and so completely, without so much as a struggle or a cry beyond that one stumble you described. It would have blunted her, slowed her responses, made the collapse look more like a simple faint than what it truly was. In those first crucial moments before anyone understood what they were seeing. Chloral, Miss Quill repeated slowly. That is not so easily obtained from a garden wall, Inspector. That must come from somewhere rather more particular. A chemist's or a doctor's dispensary. Colborne's eyes met hers. Dr. Filmer keeps a small stock for patients with sleeplessness. So does the Ipswich chemist, though a purchase there would leave a record, and I've a man checking it now. But I'll tell you something else, Miss Quill, that I only learned yesterday and haven't yet had the chance to bring you. Mrs. Pettigrew, the Fen housekeeper, has a sister married to the chemist's assistant in Ipswich. Whether that means anything at all, I couldn't say, but it's the sort of thread that wants pulling, in a case with so little else to hold on to. Miss Quill folded her hands upon the table and looked for a long moment out through her kitchen window to where her own foxglove stood tall and speckled against the north wall, swaying very slightly in the morning air, entirely unaware of the dark uses to which their gentle poison had been so recently and so deliberately put. "I think, Inspector," she said at last, "that it is time I called upon Mrs. Pettigrew myself. A housekeeper sees a very great deal in a house like Fen's, over the course of many years, a great deal more, very often, than the family she serves ever imagines she has noticed." Chapter 7. A drawer left unlocked Fen House, when Miss Quill called upon it 2 days later, on the pretext of returning a book she had once lent to Margaret Fen, and quite properly ought to return now to her widower, wore an air of subdued disorder that no amount of Mrs. Pettigrew's brisk housekeeping could entirely conceal. The wedding decorations had been taken down, but a faint smell of crushed roses still clung to the hall, and the black-bordered cards of condolence for Prudence Aldecott stood propped upon the mantelpiece, alongside 3 unopened wedding gifts that nobody, it seemed, had yet found the heart to unwrap. Mrs. Pettigrew received her in the morning room, a broad, capable woman of 50-odd, with forearms reddened from 30 years of washing, and a manner that suggested she had long ago decided the surest way to survive service in a house of shifting mistresses was to keep her own counsel and her own kitchen exactly as she pleased. "A dreadful business," she said, setting down a tray of tea Miss Quill had not precisely asked for but did not refuse. "And in my own punch bowl, if the inspector's to be believed, though I'll tell you plainly, Miss Quill, I made that cordial with my own 2 hands the night before, exactly as I've made it every summer for 20 years, and there was nothing in it but elderflower, lemon and sugar. I'd stake my life on it." "I don't doubt you for a moment, Mrs. Pettigrew. I think it far more likely that whatever was added to Miss Aldecott's glass was added afterward, at the tray itself perhaps, or even in her own hand as she carried it away, rather than in the bowl at large, since no one else who drank from it suffered any harm at all." Mrs. Pettigrew's broad face, which had been composed into an expression of proper solemnity, flickered with something that might have been relief or might have been calculation. Miss Quill, watching closely over the rim of her teacup, could not immediately say which. "You knew Margaret Fen a long time?" Miss Quill said, in the mild, unhurried tone she reserved for questions she particularly wished answered. "Longer, I should think, than Miss Aldecott herself." 25 years I've kept house for this family, Miss Quill, and I'll say this for Mrs. Fen, the first Mrs. Fen, I mean. She was a good mistress, and a kind one, whatever her nerves. Fanciful, perhaps, in her last year or 2, imagining things, if you take my meaning, that weren't always quite there, but kind. Imagining things? What sort of things? Mrs. Pettigrew hesitated, and in that hesitation Miss Quill saw, with the particular clarity of long practice, a woman weighing loyalty against the plainer instinct for self-preservation that comes upon a household when murder has entered it, and no one can any longer be entirely certain who is safe. She took against her food toward the end, the housekeeper said at last, low. Said things tasted wrong to her, bitter, she said, when there was no cause for it to be bitter at all. Dr. Filmer said it was her nerves and her heart medicine playing tricks with her appetite, and I dare say he was right. But she took to asking me, particular, to taste anything before she'd touch it herself, her tea, her broth, even her medicine, toward the very end. I thought it a sad, frightened sort of fancy in a dying woman, and I humoured her, because what harm could it do an old servant to taste a spoonful of broth before her mistress took the rest? But I've thought of it a good deal, Miss Quill, since Tuesday last, and I don't know that I think it was fancy any longer. Miss Quill set down her teacup very carefully, so that it made no sound at all upon its saucer. Did you ever mention this to anyone? To Miss Aldecott, perhaps, or to Dr. Filmer. I mentioned it to Miss Aldecott once or twice, in a general way. One does talk, sitting up with a sick woman through the long afternoons, and Miss Aldecott sat with her more than any of us. She didn't say much to it at the time, but I recall her face changed, the once, when I told her about the bitterness in the broth. Went quite still, she did, the way a person goes still when they've heard something they half expected and hoped never to hear confirmed. When was this, Mrs. Pettigrew? How long before Mrs. Fenn's death? 6 weeks, perhaps. 7. The housekeeper's reddened hands twisted together in her lap. I'll tell you something else, Miss Quill, though I don't rightly know if it signifies. The day after the funeral, the very day after, mind, before the ground was hardly settled, I went to turn out Mrs. Fenn's writing desk, as Mr. Fenn asked me to clear her private letters away before things changed in the house. And I found the little drawer at the side of it, the one she always kept locked and carried the key to on her own chatelaine, standing open and empty. Not a paper in it, not so much as an old letter. Someone had been there before me, and taken whatever she'd kept in it, and I never did learn who or what it was that drawer had held. Chapter 8. The Solicitor's Silence. Mr. Nathaniel Sharp's offices occupied the upper floor of a narrow brick building above the ironmonger's shop in the market square, and it was here that Miss Quill presented herself on the Monday morning, ostensibly to discuss a small amendment to her own will regarding the disposal of her dahlia beds, a matter of no urgency whatsoever, but one which Mr. Sharp, ever conscious of his fees, was not disposed to question too closely. A sad business, the wedding, he said, once the matter of the dahlias had been dispatched with rather more speed than Miss Quill had privately intended. I confess I have not slept easily since. One does not expect to attend a wedding breakfast and a death within the same afternoon. You knew Miss Aldecott well, I think. Mrs. Bream tells me she called upon you shortly after Margaret Fenn's funeral. Sharp's small eyes, set deep in his broad red face, grew suddenly wary. I am not at liberty to discuss the private affairs of my clients, Miss Quill, living or dead. You will appreciate that a solicitor's discretion does not end with a client's demise. I appreciate it very well, Mr. Sharp, and I should not dream of asking you to betray a confidence. I ask only whether it is generally known that Margaret Fenn's will contained any provision that might have surprised her husband, or her son, or indeed anyone else with an interest in the estate. There was a long silence, during which Mr. Sharp turned a paperweight upon his desk, with the particular deliberation of a man deciding how much of the truth he could afford to release, without appearing to have released it at all. I will tell you this much, he said at last, because I believe it is a matter that will shortly become known to the inspector in any case, and I would rather you heard it from me, plainly, than pieced together from village gossip, which has a way of growing a good deal uglier than the truth in the telling. Margaret Fenn left the whole of her own private fortune, a sum inherited from her own mother, quite separate from anything settled upon her by Aldous at their marriage, and amounting to some £4,000, not to her husband and not to her son, but in trust for a purpose she did not fully explain to me, administered by myself and by Prudence Aldicott jointly, to be used, in Margaret's own words, for the protection of any person who might in future have need of it, at the discretion of my trustees. Miss Quill sat very still. "That is a most unusual provision, Mr. Sharp." "It is. I advised against the wording, which I found troublingly vague for a legal instrument. But Margaret was insistent, and a client's wishes, where lawfully expressed, are a client's wishes. I asked her, at the time, whether she had some particular person in mind, a servant perhaps, or a poor relation, and she told me only that she hoped never to need to explain the provision at all, but that if the day came when it was needed, Prudence Aldicott would know precisely what to do with it, and I was to trust her judgment absolutely in the matter. And has that day come, Mr. Sharp? Has the trust ever been called upon? Not while Margaret lived, and now," he spread his hands, "now the second trustee is dead as well, within 4 months of the first, and I am left administering a fund I do not fully understand, for a purpose Margaret never named, with no one left alive who can tell me what she truly intended." "Did Aldous Fenn know of this provision?" "He was informed, as her husband, that such a trust existed, though not of its precise terms, which Margaret specifically requested be kept confidential even from him during her lifetime. An unusual request between husband and wife, I grant you, but not without precedent, where a woman has private means of her own and private reasons for wishing to preserve them." Sharp's fingers stilled upon the paperweight. "I will say one thing more, Miss Quill, and then I think I have said a good deal more than prudence strictly allows. Prudence Aldicott came to me, as you say, a fortnight after the funeral, and asked whether the trust might be used. She did not say for whom, though I formed a private impression she had someone very particular in mind, to provide for a person's departure. Her word, Miss Quill, departure, as though she were speaking of someone who needed, urgently, to leave Lower Nettlecombe altogether, and needed money to do it. And what did you tell her?" "I told her that the trust's language was broad enough to permit it, at her discretion as trustee, provided she could satisfy me the purpose fell within Margaret's intentions. She said she would think on it further, and consult her own conscience, and that she was not yet ready to act. That was the last time I spoke with her, Miss Quill, until I stood beside her body on the Fen lawn 11 days later." Chapter 9. Miss Quill Takes Tea. It was, Miss Quill reflected as she walked home from the solicitor's office, through the warm hush of a July afternoon, a very great deal to consider, and none of it, as yet, arranged itself into any pattern she could set before Inspector Colborne with confidence. A private fortune held in trust for some unnamed person's protection, a dying woman who believed her food had been tainted, and a housekeeper who had humoured that fear without ever quite dismissing it. An emptied drawer, its key carried always on Margaret Fenn's own chatelaine, cleared out within a day of her burial by hands unknown. A trained nurse who had grown convinced, over the long weeks of her friend's final illness, of something she dared not speak aloud until her friend's own widower stood at the altar with a second bride, and who had died, within the hour of announcing her intention to speak at last, with a killer's practised hand behind her collapse. Departure, Sharp had said, someone who needed, urgently, to leave Lower Nettlecombe. Miss Quill took her tea that afternoon in her own garden, beneath the shade of her single apple tree, and invited, on a small card delivered by her gardener's boy, both Julian Fenn and Rosalind Fenn to join her, a request unusual enough, from an elderly spinster to a young man and his new stepmother by marriage, of only days' acquaintance, that both, out of curiosity if nothing else, felt obliged to accept. Julian arrived first, still in his bank clerk's dark suit, his young face drawn with a weariness that had nothing to do with columns of figures. "You knew Miss Aldecott a long time, Mr. Fenn," Miss Quill said, once the tea had been poured and the small talk of condolence exhausted. "I believe she was very fond of you." "She was fond of my mother," Julian said carefully. "I think whatever fondness she showed me was chiefly on that account. And yet I noticed at the toast that you looked toward her rather particularly, just as your father was speaking his vows, as though you shared some understanding with her that the rest of the company did not." Julian's teacup rattled very slightly against its saucer. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Quill. I think you do, Mr. Fenn, though I don't ask you to betray anything you consider a confidence. I ask only whether you believe your mother's death was entirely natural, and whether Miss Aldecott shared that belief with you before she died." There was a long silence, broken only by the small sounds of the garden, a blackbird singing somewhere in the hedge, the distant lowing of cattle from the water meadow beyond the churchyard. "My mother was frightened toward the end," Julian said at last, very low. "I saw it myself, though I told myself it was only her illness speaking, her nerves worn thin by pain and weakness. She said things to me in her last weeks that I did not understand at the time and have thought of a great deal since. She told me once that she did not think she would live to see the autumn, and when I tried to comfort her, to tell her Dr. Filmer thought her no worse than she had been for years, she looked at me in a way I have never forgotten and said, 'Dr. Filmer does not know everything that goes on in this house, Julian, and I think it better that he shouldn't, for your sake as much as mine.'" "Did you ask her what she meant?" "I did. She would not say. She only asked me to promise her one thing, that whatever happened, I would look after Prudence, because Prudence, she said, knows too much for her own comfort, and I am afraid for her, rather more than I am afraid for myself." Julian set down his cup, his hand not quite steady. "I have not been able to think of anything else, Miss Quill, since Tuesday. I made my mother a promise, and I have failed to keep it, because I did not understand, until it was too late, what it was I was meant to be protecting Prudence from." Chapter 10. The Weight of a Word. Rosalind Fenn arrived at the garden gate some 20 minutes after Julian had taken his leave, dressed in a plain grey costume that suited her far better, Miss Quill thought, than the ivory silk of her wedding day, and carrying herself with the same decided, unapologetic bearing that had marked her progress up the aisle of St. Osyth's. "I understand you wish to speak with me, Miss Quill," she said, seating herself without waiting to be asked, "and I confess I would rather you came to the point directly than approached it by way of my sweet peas and the weather, as I gather, is rather the local fashion." Miss Quill, who found herself unexpectedly warming to this directness, obliged her. "Very well, Mrs. Fenn. I wonder how well you knew your husband before your marriage, and how well you knew the circumstances of his first wife's death." "I knew him 8 months," Rosalind said evenly. "We met in Bath, where I had gone to nurse an aunt through her final illness. I have some training as a nurse myself, Miss Quill, which is perhaps not widely known in the village, though it will surprise you rather less than it seems to surprise everyone else. Aldous came to Bath on bank business. We were introduced at a concert, and he called upon me a number of times over the following months, both before and after Margaret's death. I will not pretend the courtship was a long one. I will also not pretend that I did not know, from the very first, precisely what the village would say about a man who remarried so soon, and precisely what it has, in fact, said. You are remarkably candid, Mrs. Fenn. I have found candour a good deal more useful than the alternative, Miss Quill, particularly in a village that has already decided, on the strength of a wedding dress and a calendar, that I am either a fortune hunter or a fool, and possibly both. A faint, hard smile touched her mouth. As for my husband's fortune, Since I imagine that is the direction your questions are tending, Aldous is a bank manager of modest private means, not a wealthy man by any measure that would tempt a genuine fortune hunter to the trouble of a Suffolk village wedding. I had rather more of my own, in point of fact, from my aunt's estate than he has ever possessed, and I did not marry him for it. Then why did you marry him, Mrs. Fenn, if I may ask so plain a question? For the first time since she had entered the garden, something in Rosalind Fenn's composed face wavered, not into tears, which Miss Quill did not think this particular young woman given to shedding easily, but into something more complicated, a kind of weary honesty that suggested the question had been asked, by Rosalind herself, a good many times already. Because he asked me, Miss Quill, at a moment when I had buried my aunt and had no particular reason to remain in Bath, and because I believed, I still believe, that he needed someone. He is not a happy man. I saw that from our very first meeting, before I knew anything of Margaret or the manner of her death, and I mistook it, I think, for the ordinary grief of a recent widower, a grief I believed my own affection might in time ease. I understand now that I mistook it for something else entirely, something closer, I have come to fear, to guilt. You believe your husband is guilty of something, Mrs. Fenn. I do not know, Miss Quill, and that is the truth I have been sitting with, alone, since Tuesday afternoon, while the whole village whispers about my dress and my haste and my motives, and no one, not one soul in Lower Nettlecombe, has thought to ask what it is like to discover, on one's own wedding day, that a woman has been murdered at the very moment she intended to tell your husband something in private, and that your husband's face, when she said it, showed not surprise but dread. Rosalind's hands, folded in her lap, had gone very white at the knuckles. I have asked him what she meant to say to him. He will not tell me. He says only that it is a private matter concerning his first marriage, and that I am not to trouble myself over it. I am beginning to think, Miss Quill, that I have married a man I do not know at all, and I do not know what to do with that knowledge, except to sit here and drink your tea and answer your questions as honestly as I am able, because I find I would very much like to know the truth myself, whatever it costs me to learn it. Miss Quill studied the young woman's face for a long moment, the decided chin, the direct grey eyes, the tightness around the mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and questions asked in the dark of a marriage bed and left unanswered, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she believed her entirely. Then I think, Mrs. Fenn, she said gently, that you and I had better find out together. Chapter 11. Mrs. Pettigrew remembers. It was Miss Quill's habit, when a case grew tangled, to return to the person who had known the household longest and said the least, and so it was that she called again upon Mrs. Pettigrew, this time not at Fenn House itself, but at the housekeeper's own small cottage in the village, on the pretext of bringing a jar of her own damson preserve, and found the older woman rather more willing to speak freely away from the walls that had, for 30 years, been her place of service and her place of discretion both. "I've been thinking on what I told you before, Miss Quill," Mrs. Pettigrew said, settling into her own chair, with the preserve jar cradled in her lap like something precious. "About the drawer and the bitterness in the broth. I didn't tell you everything, and I've not slept easy for the not telling. I rather thought you hadn't, Mrs. Pettigrew. Please, tell me now." There was a girl in the house, before Miss Carew came, Mr. Fenn's second parlour-maid, a girl called Ivy Marsh, who left our service very sudden, back in the spring, not a fortnight after Mrs. Fenn's death. I thought nothing of it at the time. Girls do leave service sudden, particularly young ones, and I understood she'd found a place in Norwich, better paid than what we could offer. But I had a letter from her only last week, Miss Quill, out of the blue, asking after the family, and something in the way she wrote it, nervous-like, and asking a great many questions about whether the police had been round, and whether anyone had said anything about her made me wonder whether she left Fen House for reasons rather different than the ones she gave me at the time. "Do you have the letter, Mrs. Pettigrew?" The housekeeper produced it from her apron pocket, a single sheet of cheap notepaper, the handwriting cramped and anxious. Miss Quill read it through twice, her pale eyes narrowing at a single passage. "I hope you don't think ill of me for going so sudden, Mrs. Pettigrew, only I couldn't stop in that house another night after what I saw, and I promised Miss Aldecott I'd never say a word to anyone, and I mean to keep my promise. But I do worry now, with the mistress gone and everything, whether I ought to have spoken up after all." "What did she see, Mrs. Pettigrew? Do you know?" "I do not, and that's the truth of it. But I'll tell you what I do know, Miss Quill, which I ought perhaps to have told the inspector already, and didn't, out of a foolish notion of loyalty to a family I've served the better part of my life. Ivy Marsh's last night in this house was a Tuesday, and Mrs. Fenn died the following Friday morning. And on the Wednesday, the day between, I recall now that Miss Aldecott called at the house twice, once in the morning, as was her usual habit, and once again, most unusual, late in the evening after the family had retired, and I let her in myself at the side door, because she said she had left her spectacles behind and needed them for her journey home. She was gone above an hour, Miss Quill, on the strength of a pair of spectacles, and I never thought to question it until now." Miss Quill sat very still, the damson preserve entirely forgotten between them. "Mrs. Pettigrew, I think you had better write to Ivy Marsh directly, and ask her, as plainly as you are able, precisely what it was she saw in this house before she left it so suddenly. I think a great deal may depend upon her answer, a great deal more than either of us has yet properly understood." Chapter 12. The Letter in the Hymnal. The reply from Ivy Marsh arrived 4 days later, and Mrs. Pettigrew brought it directly to Miss Quill's cottage, without troubling to send word ahead, her broad face pale beneath its habitual ruddiness. "Read it, Miss Quill," she said, thrusting the letter across the kitchen table, with hands that trembled very slightly. "I hardly know what to make of it myself, only that I wish now I'd asked the girl a good deal sooner." The letter, when Miss Quill unfolded it, was longer than the first, and written in the same cramped, anxious hand, but with an urgency that suggested its author had finally decided the risk of speaking outweighed the comfort of silence. "Dear Mrs. Pettigrew," it read, "I have thought a great deal about whether to write this down, but I think I must, because I have not been easy in my mind since it happened, and I would rather you heard it from me than from someone who might make it sound worse than it was, though I don't know that it could sound much worse, however it's told. It was the Tuesday night before Mrs. Fenn died. I was taking up her evening tray, as I always did, and the door to her sitting room was not quite shut, and I heard voices inside. Mrs. Fenn's, and another woman's I did not know at first, though I have since wondered whether it was not Miss Carew herself, who I understand had been calling at the house that autumn on account of some business Mr. Fenn had with her late aunt's estate, though I never rightly understood the connection. I did not mean to listen, Mrs. Pettigrew, I promise you that, but the voices were raised and I could not help but hear. The other woman said, and I remember it plain as anything, because it frightened me so. She said, "You will say nothing of this. Do you understand me? Or I promise you it will go very hard for everyone, not least for your own son." And Mrs. Fenn was crying, and she said something about not wishing to hurt anyone, only to know the truth of her own life before she died. And the other woman said something I did not catch. And then I heard Mrs. Fenn say, quite clear, "I have always known there was something wrong about that summer. I have known it in my bones for 20 years, and I will not go to my grave without asking the question outright, whatever it costs me. I went away then, Mrs. Pettigrew, because I was frightened, and I never told Mrs. Fenn I had heard, and 3 days later she was dead, and I have never been able to think of that conversation since without a cold feeling in my stomach that I have done wrong by staying silent. I told Miss Aldcott what I had heard that same week, because she found me crying in the linen room and would not let me alone until I told her why, and she made me promise never to speak of it to anyone else, because she said it was not safe for me to do so. Not yet, not until she had found out the truth of it herself. I have kept that promise until now, but I think, with Miss Aldcott gone too, that keeping it any longer would be a wrong done to both of them, and so I am telling you, and I hope I have done right. Yours faithfully, Ivy Marsh. Miss Quill read the letter through a second time, very slowly, and then sat for a long while in silence, her pale blue eyes fixed upon nothing in particular, while Mrs. Pettigrew watched her with the anxious patience of a woman who has delivered a burden and does not yet know whether she has been thanked or blamed for it. "That summer," Miss Quill said at last, 20 years ago, or thereabouts, Mrs. Fenn would have been a young married woman then, newly come to Lower Nettlecombe, if my memory of the family serves me. She and Aldous married in 1928, I believe, and Julian was born the following spring. That's right, Miss Quill. I came into service here myself not 2 years after, so I never knew the household in those very earliest days, but I've heard it said, oh, it's an old story now, and I never gave it much weight, that there was some trouble in the family, before my time, something to do with Mr. Fenn's own brother, who went abroad very sudden and was never spoken of again. A brother? Miss Quill's attention sharpened. I did not know Aldous Fenn had a brother, Mrs. Pettigrew. I have lived in this village 11 years and never once heard the name mentioned. Nor would you, Miss Quill, for it's not a name spoken in that house, not since I've known it, and I only know of it myself because old Mrs. Tandy, who kept house at Fenn before me and has been dead these 15 years, let it slip once, in her cups at a Christmas gathering, that there'd been 2 Fenn brothers once, not one, and that the younger had gone to Rhodesia, or some such place, in disgrace, before ever I came to Suffolk, and had never been heard from since, so far as anyone in the village knew. Miss Quill folded Ivy Marsh's letter with great care and set it upon the table between them, and when she spoke again, her voice had taken on the particular quiet stillness that Mrs. Pettigrew, though she did not know Miss Quill nearly so well as Inspector Colborne did, recognised none the less as the voice of a woman who has, at last, begun to see the shape of something that had, until that moment, remained hidden. "I think, Mrs. Pettigrew," she said, "that I had better pay a call upon Mr. Sharp again, and ask him a question I ought to have asked a good deal sooner, not about Margaret Fenn's will, this time, but about Aldous Fenn's own family, and what became of a younger brother who vanished from Lower Nettlecombe some 20 years before his elder brother buried a first wife and married a second." Chapter 13. A Second Opinion. Mr. Sharp, when pressed a second time, proved considerably less forthcoming than he had been on the subject of Margaret Fenn's trust, and it took the better part of an hour and a good deal of patient circling on Miss Quill's part before he admitted, with evident reluctance, that the Fenn family had indeed once numbered 2 sons, and that the younger, a man named Edwin Fenn, had left England in the autumn of 1931, under circumstances the family had never discussed with the firm. Beyond instructing old Mr. Sharp, the present solicitor's own father, to draw up papers relinquishing whatever small claim Edwin might have held upon the family property, in exchange for a single lump payment and a passage to Rhodesia. "It was before my time in the practice," Sharp said, "and my father kept his own counsel about the family's private affairs, as I have tried to keep mine. I know only what remained in the files, which is not a great deal, the deed of relinquishment, and a note, in my father's own hand, that the arrangement was made at Mrs. Fenn's own particular insistence. though whether that meant Aldous' mother, who was still living at the time, or some other Mrs. Fenn entirely, I confess I cannot say with certainty. Is there any record of what became of Edwin Fenn afterward? Whether he married, whether he had children, whether he is living or dead? None that I possess, Miss Quill. The family made it very plain, in the years that followed, that his name was not to be raised, and a country solicitor learns, over time, which doors it does not pay to knock upon twice. Miss Quill thanked him and took her leave, and walked home through the market square with a mind working faster than her feet, turning over the fragments she had gathered, as though they were pieces of a jigsaw whose picture was, at last, beginning to suggest itself, however incompletely, a young married woman, 20 years before, troubled by some question about that summer that she had carried, unresolved, into old age. A younger Fenn brother, sent abroad in disgrace at a payment's price, never spoken of again, a trust established in Margaret's own final years for the protection of some unnamed person, to be administered at Prudence Aldecott's discretion. A parlour-maid who had overheard a threat, "It will go very hard for everyone, not least for your own son," delivered to Margaret Fenn by a woman Ivy Marsh had half suspected, though never confirmed, to be Rosalind Carew. But that cannot be right, Miss Quill thought, walking slowly past the ironmonger's shop, with her umbrella tapping a thoughtful rhythm upon the pavement. Rosalind Carew did not come to Lower Nettlecombe until this spring, on Aldous' own account, and Julian tells me his mother spoke of her fears a full season before that, in terms that suggest they long predated any acquaintance with Miss Carew at all, unless the timing of Ivy's account is mistaken, or unless there is another woman altogether whom Ivy took, in the darkness of an ill-lit passage, for someone she was not. She stopped, quite suddenly, in the middle of the market square, causing a delivery boy on a bicycle to swerve rather sharply around her, and stood for a long moment with her umbrella planted firmly upon the cobblestones, while a new and altogether more disturbing possibility arranged itself, with the terrible clarity of a photograph developing in solution before her mind's eye. Not Rosalind Carew at all, she thought. A woman old enough to have known the household 20 years before, and young enough still to be mistaken, in poor light and at a distance, for a visitor rather than a fixture of the house. A woman who had every reason to fear that Margaret Fenn's dying curiosity about that summer might at last uncover a secret that had been paid for, and buried and guarded for 20 years, and who had, perhaps, a very particular reason of her own to make certain that neither Margaret nor the one friend in whom Margaret might confide should live long enough to ask the question outright. She turned and walked, with rather more haste than her 74 years generally permitted, in the direction not of her own cottage but of Fenn House itself, where she intended to ask Mrs. Pettigrew one further question, a question about the household staff of 20 years before, and which of them, if any, remained in service still. Chapter 14. The Brother from Bath. She found the answer, in the end, not from Mrs. Pettigrew, who had come into service only 2 years after the events in question, but from an unexpected source, Victor Carew, Rosalind's brother, whom Miss Quill discovered taking a solitary walk along the river path at the bottom of the Fenn garden, evidently killing time before his return to Bath, which had been delayed, at his sister's request, by the unhappy circumstances of the wedding week. "Mr. Carew," she said, falling into step beside him with the easy assumption of the elderly that younger persons will always make room for their company, "I wonder whether I might ask you a rather particular question about your family's own history. Not the Fenns, but the Carews." Victor Carew, a pleasant, sun-browned young man with none of his sister's guardedness, looked faintly surprised but not unwilling. "I can't think what interest my family could hold for you, Miss Quill, but ask away. Your aunt, whom I understand your sister nursed in her final illness, in Bath." What was her maiden name before her marriage? Hartley. Aunt Rosalind, my sister's named for her in fact, was born a Hartley and married a Mr. Carew of Bath, my father's elder brother, back before the First War. He frowned. Odd question, if you don't mind my saying so. Not so odd as you might think, Mr. Carew. Tell me, did your aunt ever speak of Suffolk, of Lower Nettlecombe in particular, or of a family named Fenn, before your sister ever made Aldous Fenn's acquaintance? Victor Carew stopped walking altogether, his pleasant, open face suddenly thoughtful in a way that suggested the question had touched some buried memory. Now that you mention it, yes, she did, though I'd forgotten it entirely until you asked. My aunt had a companion, in her last years, a Mrs. Danvers, I think the name was, or something very like it, a widow who'd lodged with her a long while and helped nurse her at the end, alongside Rosalind. I remember, once, my aunt saying something to this Mrs. Danvers about a Suffolk summer, long ago, and Mrs. Danvers going quite white and changing the subject sharp enough that even I, who wasn't paying much attention, noticed it at the time. I asked my aunt about it afterward, and she only laughed and said Mrs. Danvers had a past she didn't care to discuss, and that I wasn't to tease her about it. Is this Mrs. Danvers still living, Mr. Carew? Do you know where she might presently be found? She's living still, so far as I know, though not under that name any longer, as it happens. She wrote to my sister only a month or two back, congratulating her on the engagement, under a different name entirely. Married again, it seems, some years ago, to a widower of her own acquaintance. Rosalind mentioned it to me at the time as rather a coincidence, since it turned out the widower in question had connections to this very county, though I confess I paid it no great mind, having a good deal else on my thoughts just then. He paused, and something in Miss Quill's stillness seemed, at last, to communicate itself to him, for his easy expression sharpened into something closer to alarm. Miss Quill, you don't think, surely you can't mean— I think, Mr. Carew, said Miss Quill quietly, that I had better speak with your sister at once, and ask her the name under which this Mrs. Danvers presently goes by. And I think, from the manner of your own face just now, that you have already begun to guess it yourself. Chapter 15. The Garden at Dusk. Rosalind Fenn, when pressed, remembered the name at once, though it took her a moment to place it, turning over old correspondence in her memory with the particular effort of a woman trying to recall a detail she had never thought important at the time. Mrs. Locksley, she said finally, sitting very still in Miss Quill's garden as the light began its long summer decline toward evening. I am nearly certain of it. My aunt's companion married a clergyman named Locksley some 6 or 7 years ago, after my aunt's own household had broken up, and the companion, Mrs. Danvers, as I always knew her, had gone to keep a small boarding house in Bath for a time before her second marriage. I remember the letter distinctly now that you press me on it, because it struck me as such an odd coincidence at the time. She wrote that her husband had lately taken a living in Suffolk, and asked, quite particularly, whether I meant to settle near Lower Nettlecombe myself, which I thought at the time merely friendly interest, and think now, Miss Quill, was something rather closer to alarm. The Reverend Aubrey Locksley is a widower remarried, then, Miss Quill said slowly, half to herself. I had understood him to have lost his first wife some years before he came to this parish, but I confess I never troubled to learn the particulars of his second marriage, nor thought there was any reason to. She keeps very much to herself, does Mrs. Locksley. I have exchanged perhaps a dozen words with her in as many months, at flower shows and the like, and always found her pleasant, if a little reserved. Reserved, Rosalind repeated, is not, I think, quite the word I should choose, Miss Quill, if what you suspect of her is true. Miss Quill did not answer at once. She sat very still in the deepening light, her hands folded upon her lap, turning the whole shape of the matter over in her mind, with the same careful patience she brought to the untangling of a knotted skein of wool, pulling gently at one thread, then another, watching to see which gave and which held firm. 20 years ago, she thought, a young woman came into some connection with the Fenn family, as a companion perhaps, or a governess, or some other position that would have placed her within the household but not quite of it, in the summer that Margaret Fenn, newly married and expecting her own first and only child, later spoke of with such lasting unease. That same summer, Edwin Fenn, the younger brother, vanished from Lower Nettlecombe to Rhodesia, his departure paid for and his name forbidden thereafter within his own family's walls. Margaret suspected something of the truth even then, and carried her suspicion, unresolved, for 20 years, until illness and approaching death made her resolve, at last, to ask the question outright, a resolution she confided, in some part, to Prudence Aldecott, who nursed her, and who began, over the following weeks, to draw her own conclusions. And somewhere in the intervening years, the young woman of that long-ago summer reinvented herself, first as a companion in Bath, under the name of Danvers, and then, by a cruelty of circumstance she could not have foreseen and would certainly not have chosen, as the second wife of a clergyman who was, in time, appointed to the very parish in which the scandal of her youth had first taken root. She must have believed, when she first arrived in Lower Nettlecombe as Mrs. Locksley, that enough years had passed, and enough discretion had been observed on all sides, that her past need never trouble her present respectability. And then Margaret Fenn fell ill, and began, in her final months, to ask the very questions Mrs. Locksley had spent 20 years hoping no one would ever ask again. "I think," Miss Quill said aloud, rising from her chair with the small stiffness of a woman who has sat too long in a garden chair as the evening cools, "that I had better pay a call upon the vicarage tomorrow, Mrs. Fenn, and that I had better ask Inspector Colborne to accompany me, though I do not think we shall announce our purpose in advance. There is a particular kind of test, I have found, that answers itself far more honestly when the person being tested does not know she is being examined at all." "What sort of test, Miss Quill?" "The sort," said Miss Quill, with a small, grim smile that Rosalind Fenn would remember, in later years, as the only moment in their acquaintance when the old lady's mild gardening club manner had entirely fallen away, revealing something a good deal harder and more purposeful beneath. "That involves a drawer, Mrs. Fenn, a drawer that was emptied the day after Margaret Fenn's funeral, of papers no one but Prudence Aldecott and, I now believe, Mrs. Locksley herself ever knew existed." Chapter 16. What the Foxgloves Told. The vicarage at Lower Nettlecombe was a square, comfortable house of grey stone, set behind a low wall thick with honeysuckle, and it was here, on a warm Wednesday morning, that Miss Quill presented herself, with Inspector Colborne a discreet distance behind her at the garden gate, ostensibly engaged in nothing more significant than an inspection of the vicarage's own modest rose-bed. Mrs. Locksley received her in the small parlour, a slight, fair woman of perhaps 45, with pale, watchful eyes and a manner of quiet composure that Miss Quill, watching closely from the moment she entered the room, recognised as the particular stillness of a person who has spent a very long time practising the art of appearing calm. "Miss Quill, how kind of you to call. I'm afraid Aubrey is out upon parish business, but I should be glad of the company. It is you I came to see, Mrs. Locksley, not the Reverend." Miss Quill settled herself into the offered chair with unhurried care. "I wonder whether you have had occasion, in your time in Lower Nettlecombe, to become acquainted with the Fenn family. Beyond, I mean, the ordinary acquaintance of a clergyman's wife with her husband's parishioners." Something flickered, very briefly, behind Mrs. Locksley's pale eyes, there and gone again so swiftly that a less attentive observer might have missed it altogether, but Miss Quill had spent 7 decades learning to notice precisely such flickers, and she did not miss it now. I knew Margaret Fenn a little, of course, before her death, and I have met the new Mrs. Fenn once or twice since the wedding. I meant a rather older acquaintance, Mrs. Locksley. I understand you once went by another name, Danvers, and that in that former life you were companion to a lady in Bath, whose nephew's wife has lately married Aldous Fenn. A small world, is it not, that should bring you, by such a winding road, to the very parish where, I believe, you once spent a summer, a good many years ago, in circumstances that Margaret Fenn never entirely ceased to wonder about. The silence that followed was of a very particular quality. The silence, Miss Quill thought, of a room in which a long-held breath has finally, after 20 years, been released. "I don't know what you imagine you know, Miss Quill," Mrs. Locksley said at last, her voice perfectly level, though her hands, folded in her lap, had gone entirely white at the knuckles. "But I think you had better say it plainly, rather than circling it in this fashion, if you have come here to accuse me of something." "Very well." Miss Quill's voice remained mild, but there was steel beneath it now, plainly audible. "I believe that 20 years ago you were employed in some capacity within the Fenn household. As governess, perhaps, or companion to the elder Mrs. Fenn, and that during that summer you formed an attachment to Edwin Fenn, Aldous' younger brother, which resulted in circumstances the family found it necessary to conceal at very considerable cost, his passage to Rhodesia, and, I imagine, some similar provision made for your own departure and silence. I believe Margaret Fenn, newly married into the family that same summer, glimpsed enough of the truth to trouble her for the rest of her life, though never quite enough to state it outright, and that in her final illness, with death approaching, and her own son's inheritance no longer a consideration that could keep her silent, she began at last to ask the question directly, of her solicitor, of her own private conscience, and, I believe, of you yourself, Mrs. Locksley, whom she recognised, to her very great and painful surprise, as the young woman of that long-ago summer, now settled, under a changed name, as the wife of her own parish's vicar. Mrs. Locksley's face had gone the colour of old paper, precisely, Miss Quill thought with a small, cold pang, as Prudence Aldercott's own face had gone in the last minutes of her life. "She sent for me," Mrs. Locksley said, very low, the words coming now as though a dam long straining had finally given way. "In April? No, it was earlier, in the winter, before she took seriously ill. She had recognised me at a parish gathering, the very first month Aubrey and I arrived in the village, though she said nothing then, only watched me, for months, with a look I could not read and did not dare to ask about. And then, when she knew she was dying, she sent for me privately, and told me she had always suspected there had been a child, my child and Edwin's, and that she wished before she died to know the truth of it, not to punish me, she said, but because it had weighed upon her for 20 years, wondering whether some innocent creature had grown up somewhere in the world not knowing its own history, and whether she, in her silence, had done that child a wrong by never insisting the truth be told. And was there a child, Mrs. Locksley? There was. The words came out as barely more than a whisper. A daughter, given up within a fortnight of her birth, to a family in Norfolk who never knew the truth of her parentage, and who raised her, so far as I have ever been able to learn, in perfect ignorance of it, and in perfect happiness besides, which is the one mercy I have clung to through every year of my silence since. She is a grown woman now, married, with children of her own, and utterly unaware that the scandal of her birth might, at any moment these past 6 months, have been dragged into the light of a Suffolk village's gossip, to the ruin of a life she has built in complete innocence of it, and to the ruin, besides, of my own marriage and my husband's position in this parish, and every particle of the respectability I have spent 20 years constructing, stone by careful stone, over the wreckage of that single summer's foolishness. Chapter 17. The Reckoning at Fen House. "That is a sad history, Mrs. Locksley," Miss Quill said quietly, "and I do not think any court in the land would trouble you for a girlish indiscretion 20 years past, whatever the village might whisper of it now. But a confession of an old scandal is not what brought 2 deaths to Lower Nettlecombe this summer, and I think you know that as well as I do." Mrs. Locksley's composure, which had held through the confession of her daughter's existence with the particular steadiness of a burden long carried, broke at last, all at once, like a dam giving way after years of strain. "She promised me she would say nothing," she said, and now there were tears on her face, though her voice remained, even in its breaking, oddly controlled, as though she had rehearsed this confession 100 times in the privacy of her own mind, and could not now abandon its shape even in genuine grief. "Margaret promised me, when I told her the truth, that she would carry it to her grave and trouble no one with it, that she asked only for her own peace of mind, not for any public reckoning that might harm my daughter or myself. And I believed her, Miss Quill, I truly did, because Margaret Fenn was not a cruel woman, and I do not think she ever intended cruelty. But she told Prudence Aldecott she could not in the end carry it entirely alone, and she told her oldest friend the whole of it, in the last weeks of her life, meaning only to unburden her own conscience before she died. And Prudence, unlike Margaret, did not believe the matter should end there. What did Miss Aldecott want, Mrs. Locksley? She came to me, a month after Margaret's death, and told me she believed the trust Margaret had established, the money held for the protection of any person who might have need of it, was meant for my daughter, and that she intended to see it used for that purpose, whatever the cost to my own present respectability. She said she could not, in conscience, let a woman go through life not knowing her own parentage, when a means existed to provide for her honestly and, if the daughter herself wished it, to tell her the truth of her birth at last. She meant well, Miss Quill. I believe that entirely, even now, but she did not understand what she was proposing to destroy. My daughter's happiness, my own marriage, my husband's standing in this very parish, should the truth of his wife's history become the subject of village gossip. Her hands twisted together in her lap. I begged her to reconsider. I went to her again and again through the spring, each time more desperate than the last, and each time she told me she needed more time to be certain of her conscience, that she had gone so far as to speak to Mr. Sharp about the trust, and did not intend to act rashly, but that she could not in the end promise me her silence forever. And so, Mrs. Locksley, you decided that her silence must be secured by other means. The words fell into the small parlour with the weight of a stone dropped into still water, and Mrs. Locksley did not, this time, protest them. "I did not mean for Margaret to die," she said, very low, and something in the flatness of her voice told Miss Quill that whatever followed would be, at last, the truth entire, stripped of the careful evasions that had carried this woman through 20 years of concealment. "I went to her that last week before her death. The Wednesday evening Mrs. Pettigrew let me in, ostensibly for my spectacles, meaning only to plead with her once more, to beg her to make Prudence understand that the trust must never be used, that the whole matter must be allowed to die with her. But she was so weak by then, Miss Quill, and so frightened already. Frightened, I think, of dying with the truth still weighing on her conscience, however she had tried to comfort me that afternoon, and I had brought, in my bag, a little of my husband's own sleeping draught, meaning only, I told myself, to calm her enough that she might rest and listen to reason without such distress. And I added, to her evening dose of her own heart medicine, rather more than the prescribed amount. Not enough, I told myself, to do more than ease her passing a little sooner than nature intended. since she was dying in any case, and Dr. Filmer himself had said she had not long to live. I told myself, Miss Quill, that I was doing her a kindness, hastening an end that was coming regardless, and silencing, at the same stroke, a secret that had cost me 20 years of fear. I have told myself that story every single day since March, and I do not think, until this very moment, that I have ever once fully believed it. And Prudence Aldecott? Mrs. Locksley's face, when she finally raised it, held an expression Miss Quill had seen only rarely, in a long lifetime of observing human nature under pressure. Not defiance, and not quite despair, but something closer to a terrible, exhausted relief at having, at last, no more lies left to tell. "She came to me the very morning of the wedding," she said. "She told me she had found something. A letter," she said, "that Margaret had kept, describing the whole history in her own hand, meant only for her own private record, but sufficient, in Prudence's judgment, to establish the truth beyond any doubt should it ever be needed. She said she had decided, at last, to speak to Aldous that very afternoon, at the wedding breakfast itself, because she could not bear to watch him build a new life without first knowing the truth about the woman he had lost, and because she believed, mistakenly, as it happens, that Aldous himself might have some part in what she now suspected had truly caused his first wife's death. I understood, in that moment, Miss Quill, that I had run entirely out of time and out of any argument that might yet persuade her. I went to Fen House that afternoon for the wedding, like every other guest, with a small vial in my handbag that I had prepared the night before, in an agony of indecision I have not the words to properly describe. And when Mrs. Pettigrew's tray passed near me, I found a moment. It took only a moment, Miss Quill. God forgive me. Only the space of a breath while everyone's attention was fixed upon the bride and groom, to add what I had brought to a single glass, and to make certain, by some small excuse about a soiled handkerchief, that it was the glass Prudence herself would be given next. She stopped, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that Miss Quill, at last, rose from her chair and crossed to the parlour window, drawing back the curtain to signal, with a small movement of her hand, to the figure of Inspector Colborne, waiting patiently among the vicarage roses. "I did not want to kill her, Miss Quill," Mrs. Locksley said, very quietly, to the room at large, as though she scarcely expected to be heard, or believed, or forgiven. "I wanted only to protect a daughter who does not even know I exist, and a marriage that has given me the only true peace I have known in 20 years. I told myself, at every step, that I was protecting the innocent from a cruelty they did not deserve. I understand now that I was protecting no one but myself, and that I have done a very great deal more harm in the protecting than any truth, however painful, could ever have done." Chapter 18. After the Rain. It rained at last, on the Saturday following Mrs. Locksley's arrest, a soft, steady Suffolk rain that settled the dust of the market square and brought a welcome coolness to a summer that had, for 3 long weeks, seemed to hold its breath along with the whole of Lower Nettlecombe. Miss Hepzibah Quill sat in her own garden beneath the shelter of the apple tree, a cup of tea cooling untouched at her elbow, and watched the rain fall upon her dahlias with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has, after a great deal of patient work in difficult soil, finally seen something come right. The village, of course, had talked of nothing else for a week, and would doubtless talk of little else for a good many weeks to come. The arrest of a vicar's wife was not, after all, an event Lower Nettlecombe would allow to pass without the fullest possible examination from every conceivable angle. Mrs. Bream had called at Miss Quill's cottage no fewer than 3 times in as many days, each time professing to have come about some trivial errand, and each time staying above an hour to extract whatever fresh detail of the case Miss Quill could be persuaded, with varying degrees of success, to part with. The Reverend Aubrey Locksley had preached, the previous Sunday, a sermon of such raw and unguarded grief that half the congregation had left the church in tears and had announced, at its close, his intention to resign his living and remove from the parish altogether, a decision the bishop, Miss Quill understood, had received with more sympathy than censure, given the exceptional and entirely blameless nature of the circumstances. Aldous Fenn had come to see Miss Quill 2 days before, sitting stiffly in her small front parlour, with his hat turned round and round in his hands, and had told her, in the halting, careful sentences of a man unused to speaking of his own feelings, that he had known nothing whatsoever of his brother Edwin's history, nor of his first wife's private suspicions, until Inspector Colborne had laid the whole matter before him, but that he had sensed always some shadow lying across his marriage to Margaret that he had never understood and had long ago stopped trying to name, and that the not knowing had haunted him a good deal more than he had ever admitted, even to himself, and had made him, he feared, a poorer husband to Rosalind than she deserved, in the anxious early weeks of their own marriage. "She has been very patient with me," he said, "a great deal more patient than I had any right to expect, given how little I was able to explain to her. I mean to do better by her now, Miss Quill, now that the truth is out at last, and there is nothing left to hide." Julian Fenn, for his part, had written a short, formal note of thanks to Miss Quill, in which he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had written also to Ivy Marsh, offering to see her reinstated in the Fenn household should she wish to return, and offering besides a small sum from his own savings by way of apology for the fear and uncertainty his mother's death and its aftermath had caused her. Miss Quill thought this a very promising sign in a young man who had spent his whole life, thus far, in the shadow of a father's quiet unhappiness, and hoped he would find, in time, rather more cause for happiness of his own. As for the trust that had begun the whole tangled affair, Mr. Sharp had written to inform Miss Quill, with the particular satisfaction of a solicitor pleased to see an untidy legal matter resolved at last, that the fund would be applied, at Julian and Aldous' joint request, and with the blessing of the coroner's court, toward the education and eventual establishment of Mrs. Locksley's daughter's own children, on the condition that the full history be disclosed to the daughter herself, gently and in her own time, by a solicitor of her choosing rather than by village gossip, a resolution Miss Quill thought would have pleased Margaret Fenn very well indeed, whose original intention, however clumsily expressed, had been rooted in nothing more sinister than a dying woman's wish to set right a wrong she had carried, in silence, for 20 unhappy years. Rosalind Fenn called at the cottage that same rainy Saturday afternoon, shaking the water from her umbrella in the small front hall, with a briskness that suggested she had walked the whole distance from Fenn House, without much minding the weather at all. "I wanted to thank you properly, Miss Quill," she said, once she was settled with a cup of tea of her own, "though I hardly know how to put into words what I mean to thank you for. You gave me back a husband I thought I had lost before I had even properly found him. I only asked a great many questions, Mrs. Fenn, and had the good fortune to find people willing, in the end, to answer them honestly. The rest was Prudence Aldercott's doing, really, though she paid a terrible price for her honesty, and Margaret Fenn's before her, who set the whole slow unravelling in motion simply by wishing, at the end of her life, to know the truth of her own history, rather than carry an old, unanswered question into her grave. "Do you think," Rosalind asked after a moment, "that Margaret ever suspected it might come to this, when she made that strange provision in her will?" Miss Quill considered the question with the same unhurried care she gave to every question that mattered. "I think," she said at last, "that Margaret Fenn understood, better than most of us are willing to admit to ourselves, that a secret held too long does not simply fade away with time, however much we might wish it to. It grows, instead, in the dark, quietly, persistently, like a root beneath a garden wall, until at last it must either be dug up in the daylight, where its true shape can finally be seen and understood, or else it forces its way to the surface regardless, in some form a good deal more painful than an honest reckoning would ever have been. I think Margaret hoped, by establishing that trust, to ensure the first course rather than the second. I am only sorry, for all our sakes, that events did not allow her hope to be realized quite so gently as she intended. Outside, the rain continued to fall, soft and steady, upon the dahlias and the sweet peas and the tall speckled foxglove growing innocent and unregarded against the north wall, and Lower Nettlecombe, in its slow, unhurried way, began, as villages always do, in the end, to settle back into the ordinary rhythm of its days, carrying with it, as every village does, a great many secrets yet unspoken, and a great many questions yet unasked, waiting, patiently, in the dark beneath the garden wall, for whoever might one day have the courage, or the necessity, to dig them up into the light. The end.